Morning, everyone. As we've heard from the previous speakers, labour and human rights abuses are clearly unacceptable, both from a moral point of view and a legal standpoint, as we heard earlier from Parosha. Sorry, I've got a bit of a bad cough and no doubt a gift from my 2-year-old daughter from nursery, so apologies if I have a few coughing fits while I speak. But also corporates that are associated with alleged abuse of human rights also can see their reputation affected, as Lisbeth mentioned, which in turn can have very negative impacts on their ability to attract and retain employees, business partners, customers, consumers. In fact, a very recent study from Edelman showed that the percentage of consumers that are willing to boycott a brand over its ethics, is that okay if I keep, yeah, thank you, has leapt from 51% to 64% in just 12 months. And that was across 8 key markets, which included this country and the US, but also markets like China, India, Brazil. So people are taking notice and action. And we're also seeing increasing capital being channeled through responsible investment. So it could also have a very detrimental impact on long-term access to finance, and also in some cases it has led to divestment. And I think stakeholders, rightly so, they no longer accept that companies are pushing down accountability to their suppliers through introducing things like policy documents, codes of conduct, having things in their contracts. They expect businesses to be aware of what's going on throughout their businesses and supply chains and actually take action when something untoward is discovered. But however, we've seen that corporate focus has been very much on the short-term activities, so investigations into abuses when they've already happened and dealing with sort of the crisis management that follows, or audits of a particular relationship based on certain set criteria. But once you have a relationship where an audit can be commissioned, human rights decisions that are relevant would have already been made, so you're already sort of at the back foot if you want to really influence change. And I think it's widely recognized that audits alone cannot produce sustainable long-term improvements. And I think headlines, I'm missing a slide, like the one here behind me. It's just all too kind of prevalent in the media. These are just some recent ones, and lots of them refer to the UK. And I think, and some of the sort of most common human rights violations found in the sector are sort of listed on the right. And there are a number of reasons why audit in itself has limited value in terms of a due diligence measure. One is that they rarely go beyond tier 1. Sorry, I'm just trying to, for some reason my slides are in a different order. Never mind. They can be undertaken in quite a tick box fashion by and using sort of very standardized audit protocols. And sometimes the auditors lack the skill to really detect fraudulent documentation. And Lisbeth mentioned before that the ILO has highlighted that that's increased in prevalence over the past few years. And I think they also often rely on interviewing a very small sample of workers who often have fear of reprisals or other consequences and don't trust enough in the auditors to sort of speak up. And often their responses rely on the work of translators, so that creates an additional sort of filter, and there's a risk of misunderstanding and mistranslation. And I think, as also been pointed out, particularly for this industry, it's very difficult because a lot of the workers are based at sea for weeks or months on end, so getting actually access to them is a big challenge. And also orders are often announced, and I think a lot of sites, whether that's a sort of scrap yard or a mill, whatever it might be, they caught on to how to cheat the auditors and get the outcomes that they want and desire. And I think audits can even present an illusion of progress, even though many of the conditions can still persist unaddressed. And I'm not saying there's no value in a social compliance program. It's just that there are some limitations to it that need to be considered, and also there are some other complementary activities that I think companies should also think about that are more sort of long-term and can offer deeper insights into worker conditions. So what are some of those then? I think number one is putting worker voices at the heart of any effort to combat modern slavery. And we've seen some companies started using compressed chat functions that allow crew to talk to members of family, for example, even when they're at sea. But in most cases, they lack any means of sort of communicating, so it's hard for them to raise concerns if there are difficult working conditions on board. So some companies have started introducing port-based hotlines. So when workers get off the ships and return from their voyages, they can flag concerns or seek assistance. There's also, we've seen an incredible rise in technology-enabled due diligence and worker engagement, such as confidential email, there's social media platforms, and importantly, they would have sort of closed messaging chat features, and also smartphone apps. And I know Parasha spoke about Thailand. If you look at Thailand, for example, 90% of Burmese workers actually own a smartphone, and 50% of Cambodians. Those two are the most common migrant workers populations in the country. So having smartphone apps can be a real useful tool to raise concerns, but also crucially they allow for positive feedback, and also allow for queries, and they allow for workers to sort of share information and build a picture in terms of who are the good employers, if you will. Excuse me. And I think crucially these channels need to be confidential, protect the workers, available in multiple languages. So I was working with one corporation, for example, that had their whistleblowing systems available in 75 languages worldwide. And also crucially they need to be properly socialised. And I think once workers can see that if they flag issues that leads to improvement, worker trust will increase, and you get more data coming through, so you're sort of building a greater body, a more enriched body of data to help you in your analysis. And we've seen some companies starting to use human observers on vessels. It's mostly in a transshipping context, but they can also crucially report on worker welfare and what they're seeing on board. And I think the second point I'd like to make is the leverage opportunities for collaboration. So recently we've seen the CBOS initiative signed. It includes several of the world's largest seafood companies. There's also Project Isara, who we do some work with, have a strategic partnership program where brands and retailers, importers provide their supply chain data to roll out inclusive labour monitoring. Because as Elizabeth pointed out, the more sort of collaborative approaches, the more data you have, the better. And also working with local NGOs who have those really deep connections in the local communities where you operate. They have built trust with the community members. They can offer very unique insights. And I think thirdly, making use of technologies. I'm not going to elaborate too much on this because I know we have a separate session coming up later on today, but there are two technologies in particular I'd like to mention just in brief. One is vessel monitoring systems. They are relatively low cost and a sort of satellite-based method of monitoring fishing vessels. And of course, it cannot on its own provide information to the worker conditions on the vessels, but it can be used to indicate where there's IUU fishing, which often is associated with human rights abuse, and also signals when vessels are remaining at sea for very lengthy periods of time without allowing crew to access to port. And the second technology is blockchain. So at EY, we worked with quite a few companies in terms of using this technology for supply chain transparency. And I've seen some examples where this technology is used by the fishing industry to record the journey of each fish, sort of a bait to plate type of approach, to reduce the risk that they are sourced from illegal fishing boats prone to slave labour. But coming from an auditing firm, I don't really want to completely dismiss the value of audit. It's just, I think, the limitations that we've seen in the past have led to them not creating the right value for companies and more crucially, haven't led to sort of sustained improvements for the workers. But I think there are ways of doing them differently that can enhance that value. So one of the ways is to consider that audits do not have to be done by third parties. You can upskill your own internal staff, so sort of strengthening the first line of defence, if you will. Quality assurers, procurement, human resources, compliance, internal audit, a mix of them all. Train them to perform audits, but also to provide effective support. And if external parties are commissioned, I think audits should be unannounced. They should be done by an experienced multidisciplinary team who can also draw on internal resources if needed. And that could be a sort of global multidisciplinary firm like ourselves, or also some of our clients use smaller firms, NGOs that specialise in fair labour, so Verite, for example. But there are lots of really good firms out there. And they should be based on risk-based assessment for the individual relationship rather than kind of standardised checklist approach. And I think crucially they should cover root causes and also the culture, the wider culture underpinning and allowing for those root causes to persist. And also allow for active participation by the workers. So one example is a major seafood company. They're conducting social dialogue-based audits. And very importantly, like Lisbeth pointed out, they're done in the relevant languages, so the languages of the workers. And it allows the workers to actively participate in the process. So they can express their concerns, they can express suggestions for how to do things differently, but also they can highlight if there's any sort of good progress being made. And when interacting with those workers or using that sort of worker-enabled engagement, it's also important to have some one-on-one sessions, because it could be that the controller is in the room and workers are hesitant about speaking up. And also if translators are used, they need to be properly qualified and trained. And I think we've seen an increasing move from sort of corrective action plans to more performance improvement plans. So once you identify performance gap, you work with the supplier to develop whatever it might be. It might be a new policy, it could be a change in certain practices, it could be implementing a new management system. But I think importantly, you need to look at the supplier's capability and capacity to actually instigate some of those changes. So if you have a new policy around zero recruitment fees, what's the capability of the supplier to actually properly embed that policy throughout their relationships? And I think there should be, the capacity of the corporation to actually fund some of these changes. And also we've seen more and more sort of carrot rather than stick being used, so you can tie sort of commercial incentives to performance improvements that you're noting. And I think sort of an audit done properly, they need to have the capability and the authorization to actually identify individuals that are in urgent need of assistance, and also give them that humanitarian aid, whatever it be, or even paying debt, as we've seen in some instances, just to get that individual out of the situation and really sort of help them at the first point of contact. So it was a bit of a whirlwind sort of stop tour, but I think those are, it's a huge industry, and I think there's so much that could be done better, and those are some of the sort of things that we've seen and that we are working towards. So thank you very much.